Chapter 1. Job may well be the earliest story in the Bible's timeline, the first great drama God lets us overhear, and that alone feels like a hint. Before Israel has kings, before prophets roar, before the law is carved into stone, Scripture sits us down beside a man in the ashes asking why and a God who eventually breaks the silence. As if before we ever argue about commands, covenants, and kingdoms, we are required to face the most primitive questions of the human heart. What happens when the world collapses around a righteous person, and can trust survive even when the explanation finally comes? Picture Moses in Midian, pen in hand, long before plagues and parted seas, sitting under a hard desert sky while the wind combs the sand. The sheep are quiet, the day fading, and in the stillness he leans over a rough parchment to preserve the story of a man who lived and bled before Israel ever cried out from Egypt. Job may well be the earliest story in the Bible's timeline, the first great drama God lets us overhear, and that alone feels like a hint. In the Jewish Talmudic tradition, the rabbis say Job's 210-year life spans the entire period from Israel's entrance into Egypt to their exodus, which would make him a contemporary of Moses. And they credit Moses as the one who wrote Job's story during those 40 years in Midian. The tradition goes further, tracing Job's friend Eliphaz the Temanite back to Eliphaz, son of Esau, nephew of Jacob, which anchors Job's circle in the same broad era as Jacob's children. In other words, when you sit beside Job in the ashes, you are somewhere in the long shadow between the patriarchs and the Exodus, listening to a man who lived in the same stretch of history as the tribes that would become Israel, while Moses, exiled shepherd, future lawgiver, carefully inks his words for all generations. Before Israel has kings, before prophets roar, before the law is carved into stone, Scripture sits us down beside that man in the ashes asking why, and a God who eventually breaks the silence. As if before we ever argue about commands, covenants, and kingdoms, we are required to face the most primitive questions of the human heart. What happens when the world collapses around a righteous person and can trust survive even when the explanation finally comes? Many pastors shy away from Job because it is long, literary, emotionally volatile, and it seems to raise more questions about suffering and God's justice than it neatly resolves. Some would rather lean on second-hand summaries than do the slow, personal work of living with the text until it reads them back. Job is also easy to mishandle, riddled with paradox and speeches that can be ripped out as doctrine or flattened into a cheap suffer more, complain less moral. Safer, then, to stay in passages that feel clearer, lighter, more applicable. But when we sidestep Job, we sidestep one of the Bible's fiercest classrooms. We miss the training in how to live when formulas fail, how to argue with God without abandoning Him, how to keep breathing when there is no tidy resolution. In avoiding Job, we may be avoiding the very lessons we most need in order to live faithfully when our own world caves in. That instinct quietly collides with Paul's reminder to Timothy that all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, which means the hard, strange books are not exempt. If Job is part of that all, then avoiding it is not just a matter of taste or convenience. It is a decision to leave one of God's own tools for teaching and edifying the church hanging on the wall unused. Job is one of the Bible's most demanding books in terms of genre and structure. It opens and closes with straightforward prose, but most of its weight lies in dense Hebrew poetry, layered speeches, and ironic dialogue that require patient, careful explanation. For pastors under time pressure, or with limited training in wisdom literature and poetry, it is far simpler to camp out in narrative or epistle sections that seem to preach themselves in a 30-40-minute slot. Then there is the raw nerve at the center of the book, suffering. Job forces you to stand in the middle of unexplained loss and grief, while the usual "why do good people suffer" question remains deliberately unresolved. The focus shifts from "here is the reason for your pain" to "here is how to trust God when you never get your reason." And that is pastorally hard to articulate in a culture that wants clear answers, quick encouragement, and a three-step plan. The paradoxes in Job are hard to recognize and handle because the book deliberately holds clashing truths together in a poetic, non-linear form without stopping to label which lines are lesson and which are error. Our modern instincts want clean categories and quick takeaways, but Job keeps us in tension, which makes its paradoxes easy to either flatten or ignore. On top of that lies a very real theological minefield. Most of the book is made up of speeches, Job's laments, his friends' counsel, Elihu's intervention that God does not endorse line by line. Some of those words are later rebuked. That means a preacher has to help people discern which words are models to follow and which are examples of error or half-truth. Mishandling those speeches has in the past produced harsh and distorted views of God and of suffering, and the awareness of that danger is enough to make some pastors quietly set Job aside. There are also practical pressures. Job is long, and to walk through it responsibly almost always requires a sustained series, not a single sermon. Modern church calendars are filled with topical series, holiday runs, and felt needs themes designed to keep people engaged and to fit marketing rhythms. Committing to weeks in a heavy, ancient dialogue about pain can feel like swimming upstream, especially when church members themselves sometimes worry that a Job series will be too depressing. Beneath all of this sits a cultural tension. In many Western church contexts, the tone of public teaching leans toward positivity, success, and victory stories. God is the one who fixes, turns around, and upgrades your life. Job spends most of its pages in disorientation, lament, and the silence of heaven, but thankfully climaxes with a neat explanation, with a bracing encounter with God. Finally, Job's emotional honesty can make pastors uncomfortable. The book gives voice to anguish, confusion, even words that sound perilously close to accusing God. To preach that faithfully is to invite people to bring their own unfiltered grief and anger into the open, and not every leader feels ready to host that kind of honesty in their congregation. It can seem safer to stay with texts where the emotions are tidier and the applications clearer, and yet, precisely for those reasons, many thoughtful teachers argue that Job is the book the church can least afford to avoid. It dismantles shallow formulas about why bad things happen. It exposes prosperity-tinged assumptions that equate righteousness with visible success. It teaches people how to cling to God. For those willing to linger in its ash heap, Job finally understands and shows us how to live with God's covenant blessings. So let's jump in and see what we can find. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, rising early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. In the old records preserved in Genesis, the family lines stream forward from the first fathers of humanity, through Enoch the walker with God, through the patriarchs whose tents were pitched under the wide desert sky, until the tribes of Israel emerge, including Issachar among the 12 sons of Jacob. Within that broad river of ancestry, Many Jewish and early Christian readers came to see Job as a man of the same age and spirit, standing in the patriarchal era, a contemporary of Abraham's world rather than of Israel's later kings, a God-fearing chieftain whose story fits beside the genealogies. So when people spoke of Job, they spoke of a man who lived within sight of the same stars that shone on Enoch's devotion and on the early sons of Israel like Issachar, a righteous elder among the peoples of the East whose fear of God echoed the faith of those ancestral lines. Job's home was the land of Uz, somewhere on the fringe of the deserts that later Israel would skirt on its way out of Egypt, a place remembered as near to Edom and Midian, where caravans moved like slow rivers of trade. After Job's long trial, another man fled into that same wilderness, Moses, once a prince of Egypt, now a shepherd in Midian, keeping the flock of his father-in-law and learning the silence of the desert. In the imagination of those who cherished both men, the tents of Uz and the pastures of Midian were not far apart, and it was easy to picture messages and stories crossing those dry distances. A record of Job's suffering and steadfastness, passing from one household to another until it came into the hands of the man who would one day lead Israel. Among ancient Jewish traditions, there grew a quiet conviction that Moses himself preserved Job's story, taking an older account and setting it down in the tongue of Israel. In this view, the simple, sturdy prose that opens the tale naming Uz, naming Job, weighing his flocks, and counting his children bears the same flavor as the narratives Moses shaped in the first books of Scripture. They imagined him as an editor and steward rather than the first storyteller, a man who found in Job's experience a testimony too weighty to leave scattered in oral fragments. So he framed an introduction that places this righteous sufferer firmly in his world and a closing that shows his restoration under the gaze of the same God who spoke from the burning bush. Between the rocky hills where Moses watched Jethro's sheep and the open country where Job once walked among his servants, the desert became a meeting place, not only of men, but of stories. Those who picture Job and Moses together see them not as strangers divided by centuries, but as kindred spirits of the wilderness, perhaps linked through the household of Moses' Midianite father-in-law, where news from Uz could arrive wrapped in the dust of travelers' garments. Around the fire at night, when the flocks had settled and the stars burned like watchful eyes above the sand, the tale of a blameless man tested beyond measure could have been told and retold until Moses knew its turns, as well as his own path back to Egypt. Out of that imagined fellowship of desert saints, the book that bears Job's name stands as a kind of bridge between their worlds, a patriarch's ordeal remembered in the exile of a shepherd prophet. The qualities ascribed to Job in its opening lines, blamelessness, uprightness, fear of God, hatred of evil, are the very virtues Moses needed as he wrestled with his own calling, and it is no wonder that tradition saw his hand in preserving those words. Thus, the man of Uz and the man of Midian meet in the pages that survived them both, one enduring unsearchable suffering, the other carrying that witness through the wilderness so future generations could listen for the voice of God in their own long nights of unanswered questions. As we study further, we will find amazing answers to this mystery.